OsteoSignal Episode 32. This is OsteoSignal with Neil O'Neill, a podcast exploring how osteopathic science can help you decode the body's biomechanical, biochemical, and bioelectrical signals so you can thrive. And now, here's Neil.
Movement is a metabolic signal. Every manual therapist knows that movement heals. We observe it every day. A restricted joint is mobilized and the tissue changes. An eccentric load is applied and the tendon remodels. A patient starts walking after months of rest and their pain pattern shifts. We've built entire careers on observing that mechanical input produces biological output. But here's the question I don't think we've answered clearly enough. Why? What is the molecular mechanisms that convert a physical force, compression, stretch, shear, into a cellular event that changes gene expression, builds mitochondria, synthesizes collagen, and remodels bone? The answer is mechanotransduction. And it is the most important concept in the OsteoSignal framework because it is the molecular bridge between what we do with our hands and what the cell does in response. Without mechanotransduction, manual therapy is just tissue deformation. With it, manual therapy is metabolic signaling. Your hands are not mechanical tools. They are metabolic tools. And today, I want to show you exactly what that means. I'm Neil O'Neill, a clinical manual physical therapist, and with me today is Autumn Mayberry and Brent Mayberry. Autumn, how you doing?
Hey, Neil. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. And Brent is here to keep us on track, make sure we dot the T's, dot the T's, cross the I's, as it were, and that, help keep us, speaking in language that's clear enough and clean enough that we don't get off into our own little conversation here. So make sure that everybody can understand what we're talking about. We do have a lot of patients that listen to the podcast, and we want to make sure that everybody understands exactly what it is we're talking about because it's very useful, and it's useful for the entire medical community to understand this.
I'm really excited to find out how, this physical force influences the cells to do all those amazing things. So I can't wait to dive in.
Yes, exactly. Okay, the chain from force to signal. Okay, there are 5 steps. We're gonna talk about these. Mechanotransduction is not one event. It is a chain of 5 events, and every link has to be functional for the signal to reach the cell. Step 1, force enters the tissue. Compression, tension, shear, vibration, fluid flow. In manual therapy, we apply these directly. In exercise, the musculoskeletal system generates them internally. Of course, that's what separates manual therapy from, say, personal training or exercise, is that the bones and ligaments and tendons are and joints are oriented in specific ways so that those forces can only go in certain directions. And that if there's an injury or an aberration in the tissue, that then those forces will go in inappropriate ways. What we add in as manual therapists is minor motion, that we add in directions and forces that the body would never be able to experience from the outside, which is a beautiful thing because that's what allows us to overcome and quote unquote sneak up on some of these problems and restore function to the areas that we're able to add in things through our sense of palpation, our sense of feel, that otherwise you can't get from exercise. You can't get from a stretch. You can't get from a foam roller or a massage gun or whatever, laying on a ball. Those things don't sense and aren't able to vector the forces appropriately. They're very good. The person can sense them to a degree, but there's the other problem. The person sensing them and trying to direct their own forces, they're not going to be able to be outside of themselves, and we can as manual therapists. And I think that's where we really bring in our expertise. Okay, step 2. The extracellular matrix transmits the force. The ECM, the network of collagen fibers, proteoglycans, and water that surrounds every cell, is not inert scaffolding. Now, I do want to make a comment here. I had a patient just walk in. Hey, there's this new research out that's talking about this extracellular matrix. They just discovered it. It's a brand new thing. They think it's this. And it's like, and I'm kind of looking at her going, huh? And she goes, well, have you ever heard of that before? I says, about, 30 years ago when I first started taking classes with Bear, but sure, osteopathic medical knowledge has kind of incorporated that all along, but it was just kind of like,
Along. Yep.
yeah, okay, great. And they're trying to describe all these new things that we've discovered. I'm like, well, maybe it's a new discovery to those people, but yeah. Anyway, so this extracellular matrix, it's more of kind of a gel, and it's not an inert scaffolding. It's not just a structure that holds the cells in place. It transmits mechanical forces from the surface of the tissue to the cells embedded within it. The quality and the hydration of the extracellular matrix determines how faithfully that force is transmitted. A dehydrated, fibrotic, poorly organized fascial plane doesn't just restrict movement, it attenuates the mechanical signal before it reaches the cells inside. The cells are mechanically malnourished. Step 3. Integrins bridge the extracellular matrix to the cell. Integrins are transmembrane proteins, right? Proteins that sit in the membrane of the cell, and they contact the fluid on the outside and the fluid on the inside. Their outer domain binds extracellular matrix proteins like fibronectin and collagen. Their inner domain connects to the cytoskeleton, the structure of the cell. When force is applied to the ECM, integrins transmit it directly into the cell's internal architecture. This is not diffusion. This is literally a structural connection, a mechanical wire from the outside world into the cell. So when we're putting our hands on there and we're directing these forces and we're applying various forces and trying to accomplish certain things, what we feel changing underneath our hands, or what a patient might experience, is exactly all the way to the inner aspects of the cell. Pretty cool. Okay, step 4. The cytoskeleton carries the force to the nucleus and the mitochondria. The actin filaments, microtubules, and intermediate filaments that make up the cytoskeleton form a tensioned network connecting the cell membrane to the nuclear envelope. Now, for people, just to remind everybody, the nuclear envelope is where the DNA is stored. And then also from the nuclear envelope, right, to the mitochondrial membrane. And remember, the mitochondria are special organelles in the cell that has its own DNA, right? So you're passed down from mother to child, and they are the ones that produce all the energy for ourselves, or almost all the energy, a majority of the energy for ourselves. So getting this information, this mechanical information, down to those two membranes where we can change the DNA and how the DNA is utilized, right? So epigenetic and genetic changes in the cell itself and in the mitochondria, very important. When that network is deformed by mechanical input, the nucleus deforms. Transcription factors access to DNA changes, and mitochondrial membrane potential shifts. Okay, we'll talk about this more later. Step 5, the piezo 1 opens. Piezo 1 is a large mechanosensitive ion channel embedded in the cell membrane. When the membrane is stretched or deformed, piezo 1 opens and calcium ions flood into the cell. That calcium influx is the trigger for everything that follows metabolically. So by us putting our hands on there, or the patient doing an exercise or a stretch or their normal activity of walking or working or whatever, it signals all the way down into the cell on how to live. How is it going to go forward? What should it be doing? And that's one way that you can see like overuse syndrome, where the same signal comes all the time. And so the cell orients itself that way, but it doesn't have the dynamic ability to change and do something else. And then the person goes and does something new. For example, people that are trained in running think, oh, I'm going to go do the Susan G. Komen 3-day walk for breast cancer. And then they go and walk 20 miles per day and they die. Whereas these people have run marathons, and yet here they are dying from walking. It's like, well, you didn't signal your cells to walk. You've signaled them to run. And that's why when somebody goes, oh gosh, I went and hiked them out, now I've got plantar fasciitis, but I walk all the time. That shouldn't be a problem. What have you trained your cells to do? They're good at doing that. They're not good at doing what they haven't been trained for. Okay, so there we are. Let's go with those 5. Force entry, right? Compression, tension, shear applied to tissue surface. Extracellular matrix transmission. Collagen and proteoglycan network carries force to embedded cells. Integrin binding, transmembrane proteins transfer force from the extracellular matrix to the cytoskeleton. Cytoskeletal delivery, tensioned filament networks carry force to the nucleus and the mitochondria. And piezo 1 activation, membrane deformation opens the calcium channels. Calcium floods in, metabolic cascade begins.
So if there's some kind of block to any of those steps, then the signal can't get to where it needs to go, correct?
Correct. And you don't get activity adaptation or sports training or healing. Yeah, basically the person either breaks down or continues to break down. You're correct. So
I
yeah,
see.
exactly.
Just out of curiosity, how would you characterize the extracellular matrix? It's composed of collagen and proteoglycan.
Protoglycan.
Is it kind of like a web? Is that how
It,
you would
it
characterize it?
yeah, it is. It's a three-dimensional
Or
web,
is
depending on whatever it is you're talking about. And it has it's kind of a gel-like matrix. So and it has
uh
harder things and connective lines in it, right? Like the collagen, and then the collagen forms cross bridges. So it has a netting. So it's like a net bit with a gel interior surface. So it's not like water can just flow through there or nutrients can just flow through there. They're actually electrochemically drawn through there. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of a weird place. Not
That's
something we're used to.
fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah,
I was just, just out of curiosity, what does it look like? I think, a common conception of the interior of your body is that a lot of times your organs and your cells are just kind of floating around. I don't know. We know they're attached somehow because they stay in the same spot, but just like they're kind of floating in something. And so
right.
this kind of helps me anyway visualize a little bit better about what happens when you exercise. How are those forces used to help your body adapt, to what you're doing? And manual therapy uses, I guess, that mechanotransduction principle
Correct.
to send those signals to the cells so that you can help the cells and the body at large do what it needs to do more effectively.
Right,
Does
to
that sound
heal, to
right?
train, exactly, to
Yeah,
heal, to train, to grow, right? So yeah, all those things. I mean, and it is kind of amazing that those forces acting, on your body, like you bump into something, or you wear clothing, or you wear a backpack, or you do certain things. You wear shoes. This is like there was that whole barefoot running thing there for a while, and everyone's like, "Oh, just toss your shoes and we'll just run on the street." And it's like, that's not going to work. You've mechanotransduced your shoes and feet into a different place, right? So, I mean, it's a nice thing to talk about, but it's like, but it also gives us an idea of like, how do we heal something? Why do we heal something? Why do scars form? Why does fibrosis occur? Like anytime we've had a surgery or an injury or something, like why would it fibrose? Well, those are the forces that have gone into there. Some of it might be, you were in a car accident, you fell, you played soccer and got kicked all the time in your shin, right? These things start training your body on who they are, where they live, what they need to deal with, and it will change. I just had a patient she's been a lifelong soccer player, and she had a total knee replacement on one side, and her recovery was just horrible. But from a bony standpoint, her right side was not nearly as bad as her left side. So now she's just had the left side done. And she goes, wow, my recovery on this left side is so much better. But I had really terrible bone on bone and this at the other. But it doesn't feel like the soft tissue around this leg was as bad as the other side. And it's like, well, yeah, your other side had sustained all these injuries over time that had caused this net like structures that they may be really small nets, but you put those little small nets together and pretty soon you have this huge web around her whole leg. And so that the resistance to fluid flow, the resistance to nutrient flow, the resistance to uh, taking away this fibrosis and healing and becoming normal cells that move within this gel matrix, and the tissue structures working on each other, like the fascia and the muscle sliding on one another, or groups of muscles sliding on one another or on the bone. That had all been compromised, far worse on the right side, though she didn't have the bony or joint problems that she had, as evidenced by MRI, X-ray, etc. And so you would think that the right side should have been the easy side, and that the left side should have been the hard side, but it's just the opposite. So it really tells you about the strength and the power of this understanding and this idea here about the extracellular matrix.
very cool.
Okay, so and then the ECM has to be hydrated, has to be organized to transmit force efficiently. That's what I mean about the fibrosed. It's disorganized. Integrins have to be expressed at adequate density. Chronic inflammation down regulates integrin expression. The cytoskeleton needs ATP to maintain its tensioned architecture. Energy depleted cells have compromised force transmission. In other words, we were just talking about those messages as they come through. They can't transmit the force along the chain to give it to the next cell or the next part of the extracellular matrix, that information, unless they are, if they have the proper energy, right? And then piezo one itself has to be present and functional. The chain can break at any one of those links, and understanding where it's breaking is half the clinical job. That's why we're not just coming in, rubbing some tissue and hoping and going, well, gosh, I hope things work out. It's knowing where those stages are and what the healing rates of those are. So let's get into that and talk about all that. Okay, so calcium, mitochondria, and the 3 timescales. Once piezo1 opens and the calcium enters the cell, 3 metabolic pathways activate almost simultaneously. And the timescales are worth understanding because they explain why some effects of loading are immediate and others take weeks, right? And again, this is where we add in what we add in is understanding these timescales and how to continue to work with tissue and to bring it along as if you're growing a garden almost, So the first pathway is called direct mitochondrial activation. Calcium enters the mitochondrial matrix through a channel called the mitochondrial calcium uniporter. Once inside, it activates 3 key enzymes in the citric acid cycle, which are the rate-limiting steps. Now, let's just take an aside to explain that one, because I have a feeling that Brent's going to ask me, Neil, what is the citric acid cycle? I'm going to head that one off. See, Brent's doing his job and he doesn't have to say a thing. So the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle, or the TCA, tricarboxylic acid cycle, is a central 8-step metabolic pathway that oxidizes acetyl-CoA to harvest high-energy electrons, right? Again, we talked about the electron transport chain of juggling electrons and stealing their energy while you're juggling them to get energy out of them. So it takes place in the mitochondrial matrix of eukaryotic cells, our cells, and serves as the core hub connecting carbohydrate, lipid, and protein metabolism. So how do you take food, deliver nutrients to the cell, get those nutrients to the mitochondria and have that mitochondria turn it into energy for you? So that is the citric acid cycle, or the tricarboxylic acid cycle. Okay, so, and again, the location is in the matrix of the mitochondria, right? The primary role is it captures chemical energy from food and into electron carrier molecules. And then the downstream target is delivers electrons to the electron transport chain to fuel ATP. So we have to take energy that's stuck in food and turn it into and take it through this cycle, break it down and take it through this cycle. So then we can do the electron transport juggle to capture energy. Pretty cool tricks there. I mean, but it's not just straightforward like, hey, we just take this energy out of the food. It's all magic. It's like, no, it's chemistry heavy. Now, okay, so kind of back to those rate limiting steps of the mitochondrial activation. When those enzymes accelerate, the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or the citric acid cycle flux, increases, and ADH and FADH2 production increases, and the electron transport chain receives more substrate. ATP output rises, more energy for the cell. That's awesome. This happens within seconds to minutes of the mechanical input. So this is why patients often feel energized after a treatment, after a workout, immediately they start saying, oh, I've got more energy. I feel better, because that mechanical input starts this cascade going. I mean, and think about what that means. You apply a manual therapy technique. The force reaches the cell through the extracellular matrix and the integrins. Piezo1 opens, calcium enters the mitochondria, and the mitochondria increase ATP production in direct response to your hands. This is not a metaphor. This is measurable biochemistry. So, when we're using our hands to do things, we're performing biochemical acts, if you will. Okay, so the second pathway is called AMP activation. AMP activated protein kinase is the cell's energy sensor. Mechanical loading raises energy demand. The AMP to ATP ratio shifts, right? Notice that AMP is on its way to ATP. So that ratio shifts and AMPK fires. AMPK then activates PGC1 alpha, the master regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis. Biogenesis means making new mitochondria. So yes, you constantly make new mitochondria in response to demand. And this is how we get it there. So those people who they go to work out and they're not energized, they're just, they're overly tired. It takes them a long time to recover. This is exactly the step that's not working. And this pathway runs on a timescale of minutes to hours. So we come in, we do our treatment, and for hours afterwards, this patient is going through all these pathways here, trying to basically shift its ratios and to make more energy and to make it possible to have more energy. Now, the third pathway is the PGC1 alpha itself. When PGC1 alpha is activated by AMPK, as we just talked about, by calcium signaling, or both, it drives the expression of genes for building new mitochondria, mitochondrial biogenesis. And that occurs over days and weeks of appropriate mechanical loading. The cell's mitochondrial density increases. its energy production capacity expands. Its ability to sustain future mechanical demands improves. This is tissue healing, folks. This is a body going from failure to thrive to survive to over weeks to thrive. This is the molecular explanation for training adaptation. The muscle gets more capable not only because fibers hypertrophy, but because each cell is building more energy production engines.
Exactly. And that's I think about that too, like with our patients that are getting ready to have surgery where they've broken down a joint or they're just having surgery. And sometimes they like I have a patient right now that's like, well, I quit going to PT because it hurt really bad. I'm like, you're going to be sorry that you did because now we're working with a knee that's overall way less functional because he's lost that there was no piezo1 signal, there was not the AMPK and then the PGC1 alpha, and so now we have limited capacity and we have to work really hard to try and get that back. So it's a lot harder.
And it's going to take more time, right? It
Yep.
sets them back. And of course, right after the
Yep.
surgery, we're like, okay, now full steam ahead. And as you said, that patient's not ready. And you're like, oh, okay, now you've just put yourself back a couple of weeks.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's exactly right. The absence of mechanical input is not a neutral signal. It's an active signal in the wrong direction, right? Unloading degrades the chain at every level. The extracellular matrix disorganizes, integrin expression falls, piezo1 signaling goes quiet, AMPK is not triggered. And then no mitochondrial biogenesis, right? It stops. And the cell's energy production capacity declines week by week. So the longer that they are sedentary and don't do this, the further and further they're behind after the surgery, which then makes it harder to respond to loading when it's eventually reintroduced. And of course, this is one of the places where people run into problems, right? The downward spiral is self-reinforcing. And then they go back to physical therapy right after their surgery. And the physical therapist says, well, we're going to do, now this works a couple of ways. Sometimes you get that therapist that doesn't realize where this patient is on the line, and they just throw them in at the top and say, oh, it's 25 minutes on the bike and let's do this exercise and this one. And they just kill the patient right after surgery. And then that sets the patient back. So that's the other thing we see a lot of is that, we touch the tissue all the time. So we get this feedback very readily. Other therapists might not touch the patient. Other physicians might not touch the patient. So they don't feel what the tissue feels like. And they don't know that the tissue's not ready for, what activity level is the tissue ready for? You have to
Yep.
sense that.
It's really cool. With our fingers, we can tell whether it's too much, it's too little, and we can tell that on a minute to minute or even second to second kind of basis of like, no, that's too much. And then you can but you can meet it out, and then you can measure like where's the too far, where's the too little, and where's the sweet spot in the middle. And it's really nice to be able to do that. It takes time, but I'm grateful to be getting there. So
Well, and I think that's just it, right? You have people going, oh, well, I'm gonna come over and I'm just gonna watch you for a weekend, and then I'll just know everything that you know. We get other professionals that say, oh yeah, look, it takes 10,000 hours to develop these tools and the sensing ability of these hands, of palpation. And then also with hours and hours of study to help guide it and learn it and to make it even better. It's 10,000 hours, like almost 10 years, I mean, and so, I think people think they can just take a weekend class and then they'll be as good as I am. And it's like, well, you have to work at that skill. That's an entirely extra skill off to the side. Never mind the other things we've gone through in class. So yeah, but you're right.
mhm.
It is very cool.
And we're still getting
You
better. We're still trying to refine and refine and refine. But it's really nice. You can take a treatment that takes would have taken an hour, and you can do it in a fraction of that time because you're like, nah, I know what it's supposed to feel like. I know how to angle things, so I can manipulate that. Having this stuff going on in your head, thinking about the Krebs cycle and all that kind of stuff, it actually helps you think through your patients better, and you can do a better job and be more effective in a much more efficient way.
exactly, which is kind of a funny thing to say, but we are sitting there being chemists with our hands.
That's super
And
cool.
Bear used to say this. He said that the patient, students would sometimes say, hey, Bear, can you see this patient? I'm having a hard time getting him better. And I was hoping you'd see him. And then Bear would see him. And all of a sudden the patient would be far better. And of course, in class, people are like, Bear, what did you do? What was the secret sauce? Like, and he goes, well, I did this and this and this. And they said, well, yeah, but Bear, I did that. And he goes, well, then I did this and this and this. And they said, yeah, but Bear, I did that. In fact, I did it like 10 times. He goes, yeah, I only did it twice, but I held it longer. Right. And there's the whole thing. He waited for those cells, the extracellular matrix under his hands to give the cells the information. And then those cells and that extracellular matrix to spread out and to provide that information to further and further reaches of the body so that the entire movement pattern of the body would incorporate the changes he was trying to put in there. which is a big part of what people learn from palpation is how long do you hold it? What are you waiting for? Yeah. If
Yep,
somebody tells you it's a
exactly.
30-second fix, it's not a 30-second fix, which is where like high velocity, low amplitude thrust. I mean, it's like, yeah, you can do that. That's great. But how long does that effect last if you know the fix is like this and then it's gone? How
It's more
long
like a
did the
flashbang.
flashbang? Yeah. And sometimes it's very useful, but it's not necessarily your greatest treatment technique.
It's not the
Yeah.
right
It's
signal.
It's not how the body heals, quick and dirty.
yeah, which is now one of the ways that it's used is that people go like several times a week and go bang, 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 hoping that that signal spreads out. But if the signal can't spread out because it's trapped, right? Then that's where you add in what we do. And I mean, I work with chiropractors and osteopaths who do HVLA, and I'll work with the patient and say, okay, now go back and see them, and then we'll get that flashbang, and that kind of disrupts the whole thing, and then I can get in and do more of what I'm doing, and then so again, part of being the team member of let's magnify what everybody else can
Yes.
do and effective it. So yeah, exactly.
Hey, I was just going to ask, kind of thinking about this, Neil, you mentioned all of the hours it takes to kind of learn these palpation skills and things like that. Do you think that there's some kind of reciprocal signaling that goes on in a clinician's body when they're feeling, there's some signals that get kind of put back to the clinician? Do you think that there's some kind of signaling change or things that you kind of learn as you're working? Does that make sense? We can cut
Well, it
this
makes
out
total
if
sense.
it's
And
yeah.
that's part of learning your own body while see again, part of making your body the tool is, I don't just use my fingers. I use my wrist, I use my elbow, I use my forearm, my shoulder, my back, my hip. And then also just you are keying yourself into that, in that state of this person's body, and you put pressure in there, and then how you orient yourself, because you're like, okay, this is a bigger guy, or this extracellular matrix is really rigid, so I'm going to have to position myself and I have to hold. And you'll often feel that change, like you feel a gradual change, like initial changes here, but I'll feel that all the way back in my shoulder, all the way back in my back. And so sometimes it's my hip finally goes, oh, look at that, I just moved in my hip because this tissue just gave. And it's reflecting back and saying, hey, you organize your extracellular matrix. It is what you're kind of talking about is, yeah, that also reflects into mine, which means that I have to take care of my body and I have to do certain things. We have to work out. We have to try and counteract sometimes, because if you're putting the same forces through your body all the time, then you're going to orient in a certain pattern. And that's great, but then you crystallize, and crystalline structures are easily broken. I mean, think about how do you make a really cool diamond ring? You take something really hard and you tap it along its crystalline structure and you chip it off. Well, we don't want our therapist to be chipped off. So you have to constantly redo things or do things in certain ways. Now, patients are different sizes, different lengths, different this, different that. But even the positioning, like for example, lately I've been doing far more visceral mobilization and standing. First off, it puts their organs at gravity dependency, but it also changes how my hands are working on them, so that I don't have to go hunting around. So if I've worked on a patient in laying or supine or this or that, I keep changing. What's the position of the patient? Are they seated? Are they standing? Are they prone or supine? That also changes the forces going through my body. So yeah, it's definitely a two-way street. You have to, and there's a certain care of your body that you have to take. You can't do things always the same way. You're also going to lose information because your body gets really good at getting information in a certain way. And then you've fixed everything in that direction of problem for that patient. And you're going, yeah, I don't feel anything wrong. But if you change the position of the patient, which changes your positions, now all of a sudden you'll sense something that you otherwise were missing. So it can work in a lot of different
Very
ways.
cool.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
question.
So I don't know. I think I just thought it was interesting to kind of apply that principle to the clinician too, because they're also applying force. They're having force applied to them as
well.
they treat people.
Right.
Yeah. I was just a follow up for that. I lost my train of thought. I was going to ask. Dang it. What was I going to ask? It was about. Oh yeah. So it's not also just about sending the signal. It's also listening for a response from the patient, right? You're not
Right.
just going to hold,
It's
for a
dynamic
certain amount
feedback.
of time and say, yeah, I sent the signal, so let's just see what happens. You also have to pay attention to what the body's doing and have the ability to sense that feedback that you get.
Right. It's funny because I think I kind of capture that when I teach classes. Certainly, one of the things we teach is strain counterstrain. And Autumn and I's mentor Bear used to always teach, like, do strain counterstrain first, and that way, because it just frees up so much stuff that you don't have to do as much other work on the patient. And while that's fantastic advice, I think sometimes what happens, especially new therapists, is as they're going along and finding things, they go, "Oh, I'm just going to fix this now with a strain counterstrain," and that removes a lot of the signal in the tissue. And an effective evaluation of the patient, though, means that you want to go and poke around that tissue, palpate around that tissue and the various systems such that you figure out all those signals. So if you just run in and then decrease a lot of the signal before you really truly get to see it, I feel that you're losing information, so that you should truly do more evaluation and then come back and treat your point. Whereas I think sometimes, especially young therapists are like, no, we just want to, hey, when you find that strain counterstrain point, let's just fix it. It's like, well, sometimes it's better
Just
to go
dive
through
in,
and do,
yeah.
yeah, they want to dive in. And it's like, a more thorough overall evaluation first is going to get you a lot further.
I feel like more evaluating, like by not using that first, helps me too, because then like subsequent treatments, then you're like, okay, well, I know exactly what I'm dealing with, and it makes you feel like you've done a more thorough job about hunting for the root of the problem, instead of just like, well, I can calm it down easy, but then it's not about you. Like, it's, what do we really understand what the patient is having, and then do we really know what we're treating?
Exactly. And we might miss the depth of the problem or the breadth of the problem or the origin of the problem. And I do think that's one of the things that I definitely think you can miss things. So, and I'll tell people, like, yes, it's often a wise thing to do strain counterstrain first. But that doesn't mean the first thing you do is you find a strain counterstrain point and treat it. It means that you evaluate and then you come back and treat. So yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, it's kind of
I
interesting
think
that.
I think an example of that would be like, there's certain strain counter strain points that would free up a hip, but if you just did that and then loosen it up for for a while, you might miss that the female, for example, might have an ovarian cyst there, right? And then you kind of going, well, it'd be nice to know that there was a cyst there, and that we might have this periodic thing with the hormonal like fluctuations and stuff, instead of like, well, I got the pain to go away for a while, right? And so if we really know what we're dealing with, then we're like, well, then that treatment there and the other ones are going to be much more effective if we know what really we're dealing with.
Exactly. You missed that root cause. Okay. So let's talk about fascia, the release mechanism, and why gains don't hold, right? Because I think a lot of people are really good. They get changes on the patient in the clinic, but then they don't hold. So let me apply this directly to what we do in the treatment room, because fascia is the tissue we work with most. And the mechanotransduction story in fascia has a very specific clinical implication. Fascial fibroblasts express piezo-1 integrins and connexin 43 gap junctions, channels that allow calcium signals to propagate from cell to cell across the fascial plane. When you apply a sustained mechanical force to a fascial plane, you're not just affecting the cell directly into your hands, as we've talked about. The calcium signal spreads laterally through the gap junction network, reaching cells potentially centimeters away, maybe even farther from the point of contact. Right? They've shown in research that centimeters away they can see the changes in the calcium signal. Now, this is the cellular explanation for what we call fascial release. You hold a sustained contact. Over 60 to 120 seconds, you feel the tissue yield. What's happening at the cellular level is this. You force open piezo-1 channels in the fibroblasts directly under contact. Calcium enters those cells. The signal propagates through the gap junctions to adjacent fibroblasts. Those fibroblasts respond by actively relaxing their cytoskeletal tension. The tissue yields not because you're passively deforming collagen, but because the cells inside are choosing to release based on the signals they're receiving. This is an active biological event. You are speaking directly to the cells. Okay? And here's the critical distinction. After the release occurs, the fibroblasts enter a remodeling phase. They upregulate collagen synthesis, activate matrix metalloproteinases, and begin reorganizing the extracellular matrix. All of that requires ATP. In a well-nourished fibroblast with adequate iron, adequate thyroid signaling, and healthy mitochondria, the cycle completes. Release followed by remodeling, followed by improved tissue quality. Perfect. In a metabolically compromised fibroblast, low ferritin, insufficient free T3, depleted mitochondria, the release all occurs because the piezo-1 mechanism works independently of metabolic status, but the remodeling phase stalls. The cell releases but cannot sustain the ATP-intensive work of rebuilding. and the patient returns the following week with the same restriction you released the week before. This is the cellular mechanism of poor treatment carryover, not a failure of technique, a failure of metabolic infrastructure. The biomechanical signal was delivered, the bioelectrical transduction occurred, the biochemical execution failed.
Yep, we see that. We see that all the time, right?
Yeah, people
And
come back
yes,
and
and that's where we're starting to. That's why we had so much about ferritin, because we're like, you released when you were here. We got it to work. The tissue's not unresponsive, right? But why can't it carry through? Because we're treating for health, not just for vanity or whatever, right? It's
right.
why didn't this work? So then you see that all the time.
And that's the scientific part of what we're doing, right? That is often underappreciated, you know, and let's just say just generally underappreciated, whether that's by potential patients, by other healthcare providers. If they don't understand this part, then they're not going to understand. They're going to say, well, yeah, it's nice that you push on them, but it's kind of like holding someone's hand. It's like, it's all nice, Okay.
Yeah, we want them to not need us all the time.
Well, yeah, and they don't need us all the time, and this is where I've had patients come in, and I don't want to get reliant upon you because there's this discussion out there in the ether of other healthcare providers saying, hey, don't get dependent upon your chiropractor, your massage therapist, your physical therapist, your manual therapist, you're this, you're that, the other. You need to be able to do this on your own. And it's like, yes, exactly. However, if they are reliant, it's because metabolically, right? They don't have the metabolites. They don't have the iron or the T3 or right? Something else needs to be done. And then that's where other healthcare providers need to understand that also. It's like if they're failing physical therapy or they go to manual therapy and they're not improving, that means that somebody else should be looking at labs. Now, and that's why we've gone through that saying, hey, sometimes it's you as the manual therapist go, hey, they're just not coming along like they're supposed to. Let's look at those labs a little closer. Let's get some of these tests that are more important that aren't on the standard tests, right? Like ferritin, total iron binding capacity, or transferrin saturation rate, C-reactive protein, vitamin D, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
And if they have the internal health there, then they can not be dependent on us all the time. So
yeah,
if they are, then
They'll
we're
come
like, well,
along.
it's not an addiction thing. It's there's not the health there to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And so then then those patients are much more difficult to bring along. Or as like the patient you were describing earlier, where they're so far behind that now it takes more time with me to help get them up to where they belong, because they're also trying to incorporate it, and it's a much, it's kind of like a snowball that is much slower to start rolling than if you already have a good hard snowball already going. Yeah, it's easier to roll that one down the hill. So
Yeah.
exactly. Okay, I have a patient. Names have been changed to protect the not so innocent. Andre is 41, a runner with a right IT band restriction, producing lateral knee pain at mile 3 of every run for the last 14 months. He's been through foam rolling, stretching, active release technique, dry needling, and 3 courses of physical therapy. The restriction releases in every session and returns within 48 hours every single time. On examination, the IT band and TFL fascial tissue palpates as dense and poorly hydrated bilaterally. Now, that bilateral finding again, the tissue yields normally under sustained pressure during treatment. The release response is there, but the tissue quality returns to the pre-treatment state by the following visit. This is a perfect mechanotransduction dissociation. The biomechanical and bioelectrical layers are intact. The piezo 1 mechanism fires. Calcium mediates the release. The tissue yields. But the biochemical execution layer cannot sustain the remodeling phase. And there you have it, right? It's exactly what we're talking about. Labs, right? So let's look at those labs. Ferritin 28, free T3 at the low end of the reference range. CRP mildly elevated. Vitamin D was borderline, right? Treatment, iron repletion, selenium, vitamin D, continued manual therapy weekly, once every other week initially, with the same fascial release technique. The technique didn't change. And then, some light eccentric loading for the lateral chain, right? Same old standard, typical stuff that we give out, the right kind of stretches, the right deformation, teach him how to do it on his own. We come in and we vector forces. We make sure that all the parts are coming in together. Is his trunk coming back online? Is the head getting over the base of support? Can they get the head over the foot when he's running, right? That's another part of it, is that things have changed and the person can never get their center of mass over their base of support, so that their foot is here on the right side and then their trunk is over here, and it can't get, the trunk can't move over that base of support to utilize it properly. So of course they're using IT band IT band doesn't want to respond. So it's not loose enough to allow that, right? So there you go. At 10 weeks, his ferritin was at 56. Fascial tissue quality has improved on palpation, right? Better hydration, more elastic recoil. The treatment gains are now holding 7 to 10 days between sessions. So now he's going on 2 or 3 runs before his problem comes on. He's running to mile 5 without any symptoms. And at 18 weeks, ferritin 82, free T3 is normalized, right? We're good. He's back to full distance running. IT band restriction, no, not returning. The same myofascial release technique that had been failing for 14 months was now producing permanent change because the metabolic infrastructure could finally sustain the remodel. And that was the key of recognizing tissue that was not capable of biochemically responding to treatment appropriately. Okay.
Yep. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't do on a weekly basis, but it gives words and numbers and scientific data to the things that we're doing in the clinic so that other people can understand that, so we can understand it. And that will also help us time out what it is we're looking at. I think it helps our thought process and keeps our treatment focus appropriate.
Well, and then you get that back and you're like, I helped restore them to like actual true health, right? They can't just run longer. You know, it's not just that. And that's why we do what we do is we really are looking for them to be healthier and to thrive better, like you said.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, it's very interesting. You know, like on the, and I'm going to turn this around. Let's say this is the failure to thrive end of health, and here's the survive, and then here's the thrive level. Most of the blood panels and the blood tests and a lot of the tests, they're in the, gee, we just don't want you to fall out of the failure to thrive onto the die end. But here's where medical care really is kind of focused. And maybe there's some intervention and gets them in this survive range. Well, our job is to really get them out of there, get them through this survive, and help them right back into that thrive level, which is where everybody wants to be. I think most everyone wants healthcare that provides thrive. I mean, it's nice to not die and fall out of failure to thrive. But when so many people are kind of caught in that area, you know, we don't want them falling off to die. We don't even want them close. In fact, we need to recognize that much sooner and push them over into this thrive area much sooner. So hopefully this information.
Nice.
Okay.
So it sounds like you were able to go through that 5-step chain for him to help him have more energy to, you know, rebuild or overcome the IT band restriction or whatever other fascial issues he was having, correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly.
And then also, manual therapy also helps by, I guess maybe this is part of that 5-step process, but also helps eliminate like chronic inflammation. Do you think that that's part of it also?
Well, that's part of it because that IT band knee, like, so for example, like what's the effect on that lateral knee? Chronic inflammation. So now his bone marrow in that, you know, and there's smaller bone marrow that, you know, he's 41. So he has more fat in his thigh and his femur and his tibia, but he still has hematopoietic centers in the femoral condyles and in the tibial plateau. So then he has inflammation in there, right? And then that inflammation is also going to be in his ilium, into his pelvis. So he starts having chronic inflammation in that leg. That leg becomes edematous a little bit, you know. He can't move fluid up out of that leg. And so now his calf is a little more edematous. How does that affect his pelvic floor? What does that mean for the signaling to his prostate? He's 41. Are we going to advance aging of that system, of the genitourinary tract? You know, you have to look at that inflammation spreads and then starts affecting other systems that starts causing the entire system to spiral out of control. But that's why.
So,
yeah.
I was going to say, so I think that's why, you know, manual therapy not only sends the proper signals, but it also clears out all of the junk so that the signals can get to where they need to go effectively and they're not blocked.
Exactly.
Right. I think that's what makes manual therapy so awesome. It has just so many different approaches, so many different points of attack that you know, therapists can use to help people thrive, not just survive.
Exactly. And that's just it, is that there are a lot of times that there are things that are done that it's going to take weeks to really see the changes in that. And for the most part, patients and even therapists are not necessarily going to, you know, say, oh, those changes were due to this change back here. But if that roadblock continues to be there, you're going to see the negative consequences. But if you remove the roadblock, it's really hard to see that that those negative consequences never come on, or that those negative consequences were coming up, but now have gone back down. And it's really hard to tie those together But we definitely know scientifically here, and that's what we're trying to point out here, is about there's the value of manual therapy, particularly well-focused manual therapy. It's one thing just to rub and go, oh yeah, but it also knowing all the things behind it, like understanding that the tissue's not responding, or, well, I can get it to release, but I can't keep it released. Why won't it do that? It's like, okay, let's see your labs, or let's talk about labs. Even just bringing those things up and then having the patient have a conversation with their physician is really helpful, because then physicians jump on it and go, oh, really? Okay, well, we'll do these extra tests and we'll take a look. I didn't know it was that bad. I mean, you'd mentioned you were tired, but I just didn't, you know, I kind of thought you were a little depressed. But now that you say that, maybe it's that you're tired and you have low ferritin. Let's look at it. So it's very helpful.
Okay.
Awesome. And then speaking of that ferritin, what did this particular patient do to replenish his iron stores?
Yeah, he just took oral iron. There's a
cool.
thing called blood builder out there. It's high iron. Too high of iron is a very recognized medical problem, and doctors are very loath to have iron shots, because they have to order either a infusion of iron or iron shots. So they're very loath to do that. So sometimes just high level supplementation, either fetal pregnancy level supplementation, or like there's this thing called blood builder. There's a couple different things out there, and that really helped this guy. He focused in his diet a little better. He wasn't eating so cleanly, and he hadn't been eating meat. He was like, oh, I'm going to go with a plant-based diet. I'm going to really improve my health here. And it's like, well, that's actually causing you a problem. And who knows why exactly that problem. We didn't get to that as to why he had that. Why at 41 did his ferritin go low? Might have had something to do with the plant-based diet. Might have had something to do with something else. We just didn't get through that. But yeah, so there you go. It's the different levels we want to go through. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So what we can do, right? 3 implications I want you to take from today for those of you listening. First, assess extracellular matrix quality as a mechanotransductive variable. Fascial tissue that is dehydrated, fibrotic, or poorly organized attenuates the mechanical signal before it reaches the cells. Restoring ECM hydration and fiber organization isn't just a mobility intervention, it is a signal restoration intervention. The cells need the force to reach them in order to adapt. And if they don't have the metabolites, right, if you don't have the nutrition, that's not going to occur. Second, when treatment gains don't hold, evaluate the metabolic execution layer before concluding the patient needs a different technique. Check ferritin, free T3, vitamin D, and CRP. The clinical signature is specific and recognizable. Excellent within session response, poor between session carryover. And we're talking like less than a week. If that's the pattern, the problem is not the technique, it's the biological environment in which the technique is operating. Third, prescribe mechanical loading as metabolic medicine. Exercise is not just a structural conditioning, it is mitochondrial biogenesis through AMPK PGC1 alpha pathway. A patient who is not being loaded is not building new mitochondria. Their energy production capacity is declining with every unloaded week. And when you do reintroduce loading in a metabolically compromised patient, start below their current capacity, right? Don't overwhelm the system, because then you cause the very problem you're trying to treat. The energy demand of high intensity loading can exceed what depleted mitochondria can produce, and the damage signal overwhelms the adaptation signal. Start lower, right? And patients come in, oh, I'm doing all this. And it's like, back down a bit. Let's be back down here. Let me work on you. Do it within you still feel good. Stop the activity while you still feel good. Okay? Let biogenesis accumulate over 4 to 8 weeks, then progress, right? So you really kind of back them down and stop and kind of hold them at a level and say, let's wait until you make improvements before you add activity. Okay, so that's a great one. So in closing, movement is not just mechanical, it is metabolic signaling. Every force that enters a tissue travels through the extracellular matrix, across the integrin receptors, through the cytoskeleton, into the piezo1 channels that converted it into a calcium signal, and through AMPK and PGC1 alpha into new mitochondria and the ATP that powers structural adaptation. When that chain is intact and the metabolic infrastructure is adequate, manual therapy produces a lasting structural change. When the chain breaks at the extracellular matrix, the cellular or mitochondrial level, the signal is lost and the patient returns next week unchanged. Okay. So let's go through those. I just want to redo those timescales so I make sure that everybody has those. So the 3 metabolic
And
timescales.
then this is the 3 pathways that you covered earlier in this episode. We're just doing a
Exactly.
little summary here.
Yeah, we did this at the very beginning, but I also want to add their timescales. Okay, so we talked about calcium into the mitochondrial tricarboxylic acid enzyme activation, right? Or you touch the patient, put that force in there, it gets through, calcium rushes in. This occurs in seconds to minutes, right? Immediate ATP increase during and after loading, right? So this should happen in the session. If this is not happening during your session, there's something wrong. What's their calcium level, right? What's their hydration level? They're literally, what's their water level? What's their, you start going for more basic metabolites like, hey, when people have cramps, like, oh, calcium, magnesium, do they have enough water? Do they have, so we come back a step in the whole metabolites. Now, our second step is AMPK activation to PGC1 initiation. This occurs within minutes to hours. Metabolic reorientation, increased fuel uptake, right? So that the cell starts taking on more. The mitochondria start saying, hey, we're going to build something more. And that takes up to hours. So what is that patient doing? Like, do they go after their session with you? Do they jump in the car and drive for 6 hours? Do they go out and run 10 miles and overload the tissue? Do they do something that upsets this second aspect, right? And then PGC1 alpha to mitochondrial biogenesis. This takes days to weeks. New mitochondria are built, a sustained increase in energy production capacity. So the progression of the exercise has to be appropriate, or the activity level, whatever that is. Like for some patients, if their activity is sitting at a desk, then that's their activity, right? So you have to say, hey, look, you've got to make changes to that. You can't just sit there for 12 straight hours and expect not to hurt, right? Okay, so let's look at the clinically useful mechanotransduction signals. Now, Brent's going to post these for you guys so you'll have access to them, or I'll have them on my website as well.
Yeah, and I'll throw up the image here as as Neil's narrating here, and then we'll include it as part of the show notes as well.
Okay, perfect. Clinically useful mechanotransduction signals, right? Cellular piezo-1 integrin, direct fascial and structural remodeling, requires metabolic infrastructure to complete, right? They have to have ferritin. They have to have vitamin D. They have to have water. They have to have all those things. Neural mechanoreceptors, right? To the NTS, nucleus tractus solitarius. For those of you at home, remember, NTS means Vegas, baby. And what happens in Vegas doesn't necessarily stay in Vegas in this case. This isn't your parents' Vegas. This is your Vegas. So heart rate variability improvement. I know, right? HRV improvement, autonomic shift, pain modulation. Hey, if the suboccipital muscles don't work, the ribs don't work, if the diaphragm doesn't work, you're not, the vagus nerve cannot do its job. It can't lead you to health if health is not possible. And that's exactly what those are. And that's why you come and see us, because those areas have to work properly. The eNOS, or nitric oxide, right? Vasodilation, improved microvascular iron delivery to iron-restricted tissues, right? If you don't have nitric oxide, if your extracellular matrix is off, the fascia can't stretch and produce nitric oxide. Doesn't have the energy to do that. It takes energy to produce these things. If it doesn't even have enough energy to keep itself healthy, how could it produce these other things that keep other cells in the area healthy? Okay. Connexin 43 gap junctions, calcium signal propagates beyond contact point. Regional response to focal technique, meaning the cells in the area are responsive to each other. You have an ecosystem of cells, of muscles, of ligaments, of tendons, of bones, of fascia, of arteries and veins and nerves. The ecosystem has to all communicate with one another, work together. Whereas if everybody's trying to get their own and and protect their own, they're not going to transmit force. They're not going to protect. They're not going to share, energy or any of that stuff. They're going to take what they can and hold on to it. That's not an integrated whole. That's not an ecosystem. That's all, every cell for itself. And then clinical signature reference. When you get your finding is you get good within session release, but it reverts within 48 to 72 hours. Biochemical execution failure, evaluate ferritin, free T3, vitamin D, CRP. Poor within session response in a tissue that should release. Consider the ECM quality, integrin integrity, or load below cellular capacity. In other words, you're overwhelming the tissue. So that's how you know how hard to push. If you're overloading the tissue, you're overloading the tissue. It doesn't want to change. It can't change. You've basically just attacked it. It's like, it can't work itself through the change. Bilateral fascial
Would you say
restriction.
that's what's happening too? Sorry. Would you say that's what's happening too when we treat for too long of a session?
Yeah, you overload this. Yeah, you take up too much energy and the system just locks up. So we often call that a sympathetic response, but the sympathetics are called in to protect because
Okay.
they're
Yeah.
going, okay, we're overwhelmed. The cells are saying they're overwhelmed. They sent us a signal. They said, leave us alone. Okay, bilateral fascial restriction without bilateral mechanical cause. Systemic metabolic flag, not a local problem. It's either a bilateral ain't good, as Barry used to say. Now that is because it could be in some structure with nerves from both sides, right? And this is what we call our midline structure problem. That can be a uterus. That could be a pubic symphysis. That could be a TMJ, an SCM, or an SC joint. It could be a lot of things, right? So yeah, so that's when to look somewhere else. Okay, so look systemic in that situation. Loading that produces pain or delayed soreness disproportionate to the dose, like how much you touch them. That's mitochondrial capacity exceeded. Reduce the load, reduce how long you treat them. A lot of patients ask me, like, gosh, you're only treating me for 30 minutes or this, that, the other. And I really want an hour. It's like, let's go through half an hour first and let's see if you can handle an hour. So I certainly limit how much time I spend with the patient, like directly putting hands on. I might have them do other stuff during extra time, but then like no more than 30 minutes direct hands on. You have to allow biogenesis before progressing. In other words, and this is kids, right? Oftentimes with kids, I tell the parents, bring their sibling or come prepared for you to get the rest of the treatment because we've got 5, 10, 15 minutes max. And then and first off, the kid's done, their attention span's done. But part of it is that they're keyed into this and they go, nope, I'm done. Don't touch me anymore. I've had enough. And listen to that. When a patient says they've had enough, they've had enough. So our job is to identify where the chain is breaking. Sometimes it's mechanical. Sometimes it's the signal transmission. And sometimes it's the metabolic execution layer, the most commonly missed and most correctable, right? So keep that in mind. And we need to find the source. And that's part of what we do as manual therapists, as osteopathic manual therapists. That's the osteopathic and the osteopathic manual therapist. We're not just pushing on tissue. We are reading the tissue. It is a sign. It's a symptom. It's a sign, and it's a conduit to the health of the body. Okay. All right. So hopefully that was useful for everybody. I'm Neil O'Neill, and with me is Autumn and Brent Mayberry. And until next time, pay attention to the signals.
Thanks, Neil.
Awesome, Neil. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of OsteoSignal. For more information, visit PursuitPT.com or PursuitPerformanceTraining.com. Want to show your support for the podcast? Like this episode, hit that follow or subscribe button and leave us a comment or review. Remember, this podcast is for informational purposes only. Please consult your healthcare provider regarding any medical procedure. Copyright 2026, Neil O'Neill, PT.